Hello, today I have a very special video for you. I've the pleasure of introducing a brand new book by Joyce Carol Oates called The Ruins of Contracoeur. This has just been published by Swan River Press in Dublin, who contacted me asking if I'd like to host the launch of this collection. And since Joyce is my favorite author, of course, I'm very happy to do it. And I'm thrilled that Joyce is here and will be interviewed by author Lisa Tuttle, who wrote the introduction for this book of short stories. As you may have seen in my previous videos, I've discussed Oates' writing many times and interviewed her multiple times. But if you're not familiar with Oates' writing, she is one of the preeminent American authors working today, having published over 50 novels and over 40 collections of short stories and won many awards. Her writing is ceaselessly daring, insightful, and surprising. If you can believe it, this is the third collection of short stories she's published this year, alongside her novel Breathe, which came out a few months ago. She's well known for producing powerful stories of realism, but a significant portion of her work also utilizes different styles of writing to explore darker realms of the imagination. Swan River Press specializes in literature of the Gothic, fantastic, strange, and supernatural. At this time of year especially, I do enjoy dipping into some dark tales of Gothic mystery and sinister horror. The 6 stories which are included in the Ruins of Contracoeur encompass these elements, but as they are written by Oates, they also include many deeper themes, such as challenging family dynamics, the resilience of girls, economic divisions in society, and the heartbreak of grief. The line between the living and the dead becomes blurred as we follow the thoughts and actions of individuals who've been wronged or wronged others. While some seek vigilante justice, there's not always a clear moral compass used by the complicated personalities which inhabit these stories. These prose are teeming with emotion. They create an atmosphere of unease in the reader's imagination and a feeling of suspense with each page that is turned. The story Mr. Stickham is predominantly narrated in the collective voice of a group of teenage girls who carry out deadly revenge upon predatory men. In The Cold, we find ourselves disconcertingly aligned with the mind of a grief-stricken woman whose experiences become increasingly hallucinatory. With the story Monster Sister, we experience an alarming sensation of body horror, but we're also left with a melancholy sense of what it'd be like if a distorted version of ourselves were to take our place within our own family. The story Commencement may feel like it's set in the most civilized environment imaginable, but its conclusion is so shocking and barbaric, you won't believe what you're reading. The Redwoods is one of the most original ghost stories I've read, and the title story, The Ruins of Contracoeur, builds an environment so menacing. I felt terrified for the children trapped in this dilapidated family estate. It also took me back to the territory of Oates' brilliant and wildly imaginative sequence of Gothic novels, which you can see lined up here behind me. But I found these stories thrilling, complex, and haunting. Also, the author photo used in this collection, which you can see here. I've not seen this before, and it's such an eerie image. I think it's perfectly suited to this collection. So I'm very excited to listen to Joyce in conversation with distinguished author Lisa Tuttle. Lisa is also an award-winning author of science fiction, fantasy, and horror. She's published more than a dozen novels and collections of short stories, as well as nonfiction and a reference book on feminism. Coincidentally, like me and the publisher of this book, Lisa is also American-born, but has ended up here across the pond. But through the wonder of our video screens, we expats are able to connect with Joyce, who is still in America. So I will now hand things over to Lisa to discuss these stories and writing in general with Joyce.
Thank you. Good. At least I don't have to try and introduce you. That was a wonderful introduction.
Oh, wonderful. And we're all Americans. That's bizarre.
Yes.
I mean, that's really weird. That's actually weird that we're all Americans. Yeah.
But not all in America. Yes. Yes. So I thought we would try and mainly circle around this book, since we are talking about this collection. This is a launch for the collection. So maybe we could start just talking about individual stories, if you have anything in particular.
Thank you for your wonderful introduction. It was just so uplifting and heartening to read that wonderful introduction.
Thank you. Good. Well, I was actually quite honored to be given the opportunity to introduce you. Although I have to say, you've written so much that it was impossible to go back and like reread many of your books or stories. In fact, one thing I was going to ask you was, do you know what number in all of your collections? I mean, Eric just said you've had more than 40 short story collections. Do you know what number this one is?
Well, I don't think really in those terms. Like writing to me is sort of like dealing with dreams and things that are just so fascinating in the moment that I'm not really thinking about the past. And I think they're very much like dreams, because when you're working so intensely and really kind of a thrillingly existentially real experience, you're not really thinking about the past. When we're immersed in a dream, we have no idea that we've had 100,000 preceding dreams, because they're completely gone now. So I don't know. I don't even think in those terms. And there are lots of things I don't think about quantitatively. I mean, I don't know how many copies of a book are sold. I don't know this. I don't know that. I think I sort of don't want to have my head crowded by this stunning reality.
Or numbers, just having to think about numbers.
Right.
I find numbers very forgettable. I was looking at something the other day and I said, and then I'd forgotten, and I was mentioning it to my husband and I said, oh, well, it was a book I was reading. It's either set in 1963 or 1968. And he said, there's a big difference. And I said, I know, I just can't remember, because that wasn't the main issue. It was just, I knew it was set in the 60s.
Well, we're all writers here. I think everyone who's involved in this Zoom. And I think there's just something about being a person who works in the imagination that you literally don't have time. Maybe the neural capacity gets filled up, but you just don't really care so much about quantitative things. Whereas other people do. I mean, I do know people who could sort of rattle off how much money they have or how many miles it is to the sun, that somehow that means something to them.
Yeah. It's more, one of the things that I get from your stories is very often it's the mood, it's the atmosphere, it's the psychological state of the characters. And something that just occurred to me today, I don't know why, I just jotted it down, writing as an out-of-body experience, because it's almost like you go into whatever character you're writing about, you're kind of in them. You aren't yourself anymore. I think that seems particularly true of your writing.
Yes.
And sometimes I have to say, your novel Zombie, which won the World Fantasy Award, I think, it won one of the major awards in the field. But I remember when it came out, I thought, oh, I can't read this because it's being in the head of a serial killer. And actually, I'd forgotten what it was about. And I thought, zombie. Oh, did Joyce write a zombie novel? Oh, I wonder what, that sounds rather interesting. And then I looked it up and realized, no, it was I guess a metaphor rather than being about zombies.
Well, he wants to create a zombie. He wants to create a zombie. That was, to me, that was an experimental, started up as a short story. And the idea was to put myself in the consciousness of a person very different from myself. I mean, to say that he's misogynist is like a mild thing to say about him, but that he's not thinking, his mind doesn't work the way our minds work. And he thinks almost in a visual sense. An idea will come to him ahead of his rational apprehension of it, which is a reversal of most of us. We think ahead and we're sort of thinking consciously. But there are some people who are so in the grip of fantasy and they're sort of guided by subterranean instincts that they think they know ahead of time what they're going to do before they know it intellectually. In other words, they're preparing to do something before their minds have caught up. And I think most of us are the other way around.
Well, I think, I mean, in a way, that's like when people, you know, when they start talking about trying, well, I mean, journalists or commentators or politicians, where they say, we've got to stop crime by making the punishment so much more severe. I think that'll never stop crime, because people don't commit crime, don't stop themselves from committing a crime because they think, oh, if I get caught, I'll be locked up forever, or I might be executed.
Right.
That's just not the way. Even kind of normal people don't work that way. You know.
Well, the different kinds of crime too. There's organized crime, white collar crime, you know, corporate crime, which is extremely premeditated and, you know, frankly has a lot of enablers who are not criminals, like lawyers and tax accountants. You know, it's like this big organization, whereas this psychopath is guided by his or her or their instincts, and they're really not that much in control. And the great joy of their lives is fantasy, and it starts when they're in, I guess, puberty and, you know, young adolescence. The fantasy element of their lives becomes so seductive, whereas the reality is disappointing, or they're not successful at, you know, like in high school, they don't have a social success, so they're drifting into this world of fantasy, and that becomes the only source of happiness for them. So they're kind of gravitating toward that, and that's very different from, you know, organized crime.
Oh yes, very different. Anyway, we should get back to the let's get back to the stories. I wanted just one thing, commencement. Now I know that first appeared in an anthology that Ellen Datlow edited, they were all kind of Lovecraftian stories. And on the surface, it seemed a very unusual Lovecraftian story until, as I think I mentioned in the introduction, your description of a Lovecraft story as a person who they involve someone, a protagonist is usually a scholarly gentleman who doesn't, you know, gets involved or becomes close to some sort of evil force that he should really run away from, but he doesn't until it's much too late. And it struck me, there were several things about it. One was that's very much a description of an M.R. James story.
That's right.
Yeah. And I wondered, I know you've written about Lovecraft and you've spoken about Lovecraft, but what is your feeling about M.R. James as a writer? Do you?
Well, I have read many stories. I have read many stories of his, but to me, they're not as memorable. They're not as sensuous or vivid as Lovecraft. But I read them more recently. Lovecraft, I started reading when I was like 12 years old. So that's part of it too. The part of Lovecraft I'm not at all interested in is the actual monsters and, you know, creatures like that. I have zero interest in that kind of science fiction or horror or whatever. It sort of shades into comedy, you know, Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy or something like that.
Yeah. Well, the more he describes it, the less interesting.
The greatest of Lovecraft stories, I think, is The Rats in the Walls, which in a way doesn't have anything supernatural. There are a lot of rats in those walls, but probably you go to New York City, certain parts of New York, or Manhattan, you know, a lot of rats in those walls too. But I think that story is just brilliant. I can't teach it so well now because of political correctness. There are things in it that would be offensive to some people. In fact, almost everything that we find exciting in literature is offensive to somebody today. So that's getting to be a problem.
Yeah. Yes, I think The Rats in the Walls, that's one I remember reading as a child, and it was the scariest thing I'd ever read. And it was kind of like a Poe story in a way, because if you think about like the Black
Yes,
Cat or the Telltale
that's right.
Heart. Yeah.
That's right. And
But
fall of the House of Usher.
yeah. But anyway, I wanted to ask you, when you wrote Commencement, was that in response to Ellen Datlow asking you for a Lovecraftian story, or had you already
Well,
written it?
Are you sure that's the provenance of it? Because I don't really remember that. I wrote that story because I had been sitting through a 3-hour commencement in the sun, in my robe, getting an honorary doctorate on stage. I did that a number of times, and I think as I sat there, and there's nothing so horrific as being trapped in a ceremony like outdoors in the sun, and then they have the actual commencement where each undergraduate walks across the stage and gets a handshake from the president of the university, and you sit there. So while I sat there, I was sort of writing this story in my head. That's the genesis, and I don't remember. I thought it was somebody. I don't really remember, where it ended up.
Mm-hmm. Oh, no, that's very good to know, because I was curious whether, it had been inspired by, write me a Lovecraftian story, or whether you'd already written it. And Ellen said, this is Lovecraftian.
No, I don't honestly think anybody would think of writing that story.
No.
Who had suffered through an actual commencement in exactly that way.
I'm sure you've suffered through many.
Some other awful things about commencements too that come back to me with a crushing horror, memory, but we don't have to go into it.
Yes, and there is something rather like a religious ceremony about it. It's dull, it's deadening. You have to be there. It's a sort of. It could also be similar to like a Nazi rally or a political rally, or all of those things. But I think it probably, if you only go through it once, I mean, I didn't even go to my college graduation, actually. So I think I only went to, and I've never been given an honorary degree. So
the pleasure lies ahead. I don't want to sound cynical. I've had nice experiences. Say I have 25 or so of these memories. I'm really only thinking about 4 or 5 that were excruciating. The others were nice. And there was a wonderful commencement at University of Pennsylvania, and Denzel Washington gave the commencement speech. He was absolutely wonderful. I guess he's a graduate of Penn. And a friend of mine is president of Penn. And that was perfectly nice. And if anybody's listening to this, I'm actually I'm not complaining about honorary doctorates. It's just somehow I stumbled into giving more information than I should have.
No, I'm sure. And you were writing a fiction. It was, sometimes even if you're not feeling horrified, you can notice something and you can think, that would be an interesting story. Or as you say, in a dream.
Well, conflating that, the ancient Aztec and Inca ceremonies of tearing out the hearts of people. And when you think about rituals and rites, religious rites generally, there's some sort of sacrifice. So just sort of putting the secular situation of graduating from college or getting an honorary doctorate, a secular experience, and along with the sacred, and seeing the obvious parallels between the two. The ideas for the elder people who have achieved something, a scientist or a statesman or somebody, they're sitting up on stage, and the young people are supposed to get some sort of I guess, inspiration from them, and looking at, instead of deconstructing it, it could be almost like a sacrifice. Of course it isn't. When I started getting invited for honorary doctorates, which was a long time ago, I remember Red Skeleton was always getting an honorary doctorate too. And then Ann Landers would be, these people are to draw in the crowds, like Red Skeleton. It's probably forgotten today, but he was a comic.
On TV, yeah.
Yeah, and I would be on stage with somebody like Red Skeleton, Ann Landers, and some other like pop figure. Well, Denzel Washington, I mean, you get a lot of applause for when you walk in when Denzel Washington is among your cohort.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it is the lure of celebrity or fame, but there also is that sense of, what do they call it, mana, where it's like you can almost pass it from by touching the hem of their garment, or just breathing the same air as
yes, it's so strange, and we don't need to talk about it too much longer, but there are some celebrities who exude such an air. It to experience it firsthand is actually quite astonishing. I mean, I've had people come into this house, like workmen, and they see a photograph of of Mike Tyson and me, wow. And they just stare at that and they say, is that Mike Tyson? And they're like, their faces are undergoing some change that I've never seen directed toward me. Like they are their jaws literally drop. And I say sort of, oh yes, I said, this is quite a long time ago in 1987. And then they look at me and they say, you're with Mike Tyson, and then they look at me as if there's some sort of radiance, and they say, can I have your autograph? Like they have no idea who I am. And so it's like 2 degrees removed from Mike Tyson, who himself now, is kind of dethroned. He was once a great boxer, he isn't anymore, but these degrees of charisma or radiance or the sacred are astonishing to behold, because if you wrote it in a book, in a story, it would seem, oh, that's exaggerated, but it actually isn't. And then these people walk out of your house with big smiles, like they're just, you said the hem of the garment. It's something like that.
This was another question that came to my mind about the same story, Commencement, but only because it appeared in a Lovecraftian anthology, is, are you ever inspired to write kind of homages to writers that have influenced you or that you admire?
Oh yes, I've done that a number of times. I have a number of stories. Well, one is in Wild Nights, a collection where Emily Dickinson and Edgar Allan Poe, Ernest Hemingway, Mark Twain, and Henry James are in this strange. So each story is an exploration of the what I thought I'm sort of perceiving to be the underlying subterranean obsession of that person. Like the Edgar Allan Poe story is about something that Poe as a person never wrote about. So I would think that he was not writing about a certain subject, that it actually had a lot of power to him. So the story is about that particular subject. And then the Hemingway story is about his suicide, he being drawn into suicide. Then I have a story about Robert Frost, which is mostly an interview with him. It's a made-up interview, but almost all of his replies are real. I mean, taken from research. And that story appeared, I think, in Harper's Magazine, and a whole lot of people wrote in and they were very angry. And they said, how could you present Robert Frost in this way? He's saying these awful things. I said, well, he said them, not me. I'm just sort of putting them down there.
Well, that's very interesting. And that makes more sense to me, because I thought, if you just tried to kind of, absorb their style, it would be less interesting. But, and because I tend to think of your style is very distinctive, even when you're writing about completely different things. if you see what I mean. You can explore many different,
Yeah, and I've written about Henry David Thoreau and James Joyce and Chekhov also, The Lady with a Pet Dog, which is interesting.
Wonderful story.
Yeah, I'm so interested in experimentation. I just wish somebody would send me a list of interesting experiments to do so I could just sort of work on them. But if your work is too experimental and formal, it's not so accessible to readers. The genre that's most accessible is the novel of social realism, where you have a very recognizable family in a context of a recognizable situation. It could be suburban or urban America, and everything is just sort of the illusion that it's all real. It's like a stage set, that a social realism is what most people can relate to. But if you have like magical realism was introduced, I guess, originally by maybe Faulkner, who was sort of working in this surreal, and then Gabriel Marquez really perfected this wildly imaginative and yet sort of psychologically valid kind of writing. So many people can read that, but I think a large population just can't deal with that. So if you're not trying to completely bankrupt your publisher, you sort of stay away from experimental writing in much quantity.
Yeah, it's true, because even books, genre books like horror, genre horror, tends to be quite realistic in style, not experimental. So
I can't really. I'm not interested in fantasy at all. I mean, I'm just literally not interested in fantasy or romance. The genres that do sell very well, I somehow just have no interest in that. I'm very interested in surreal and speculative fiction, slipstream fiction, where you are basically in somebody's real psychology and real person, but then that person has some experiences that are veering away from strict realism.
I thought that the Redwoods in this struck me as the most experimental, because you kind of, if you read it a second time, it's like when I was reading it at first, it was I was sort of, did I misunderstand that? And it isn't just the fact that it's told from the point of view of a dead person. It's his own memories, which are constantly mutating, as, indeed, memory sometimes does. But it was,
that's a sad
kind of.
So many of my stories are sad stories for me because I wrote them before my life kind of fell apart, and I was sort of working with the idea of a husband who had died, and he's come back to visit his wife, who's just sort of sitting there, and she's almost catatonic, and he keeps coming back, and eventually she's going to sort of come to life and have a life after him. But then when, that's tragic too. There's something about grieving and mourning that is precious. But there's maybe one day where you wake up and you don't think about what you've lost for an hour. Like suddenly this other world is sort of, the real world is coming back. And that's kind of sad. Too. So the Redwoods is definitely, it's hard. It's hard for me to look at that.
Yeah, I can see that. And the oldest story in the book is is the Ruins of Contracoeur, which kind of draws on, though, it's the same sort of background as all of the whole Gothic series that you wrote. I don't know if they call it the Gothic saga.
Yeah, yes, it's probably from that time.
Yeah,
it seems strangely contemporary when I reread it myself, and that seemed a little weird. This politician who's in exile and disgrace, so to speak. Somehow it seemed like something that could have happened in the Trump administration.
Oh, absolutely. Well, it's very much of, I think, what's happening a lot in the past decade has been people who were, whether they were politicians or actors or movie producers or just wealthy men, suddenly being brought low, by things that they'd been able to sort of push away for years. And
Yes.
whether, whatever it was they did, they're now having to answer for it, and they're in exile. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting how times literally do change as we get older. Things
Yeah.
that were sort of hidden and not talked about at all, taboos, they're much more exposed now. And part of it is the grassroots democracy of the cell phone, where people can be video recording horrific things happening that only were reported in print by the mainstream media, or not reported.
Or not reported.
Yeah, or like lynchings, or white policemen brutalizing Black people, which is sort of like a lynching right now. But none of that was visually present. So we might read about it in the newspaper in a little article or something like that, But now we actually
see a video. Yeah, you see it. And also, there's also the whole, as you said, it's the kind of, I don't know what, democratization of journalism almost, is that people just say something, they put it up on YouTube or Instagram or Twitter. And
right. I wouldn't have thought of Mr. Stickham, or writing Mr. Stickham probably, and 20 years ago. It's a consequence of people being middle class, sort of safe white girls, being aware of girls who are trapped in a sex trade, and they're abducted and so forth. Like they're being aware of a subterranean group of girls completely deprived of the affluence and families that they have. There's sort of like two levels. And the fantasy would be that girls on this level would care about girls on the other level, that this is maybe the most fantastic element of that story.
Yeah. Well, the other
social justice,
But you could also see it not even just as, it seemed to me you could read it on two levels. One is that they care. The other is it's just a kind of fad. It's something to do. They're bored. They don't understand, where is this happening? Where is it happening around here? Well, it isn't happening around here. So let's make it happen around here, and then punish the men for what they want.
I wanted them really to be they're not typical high school students, obviously. No, they're really suffused with a sense of a sisterhood and this wish for justice, which is what we feel often when we're on Twitter or online, or aware of terrible injustices. And we feel that we just can't do much about it, voting once every 4 years is such a weak response to some of these emergency situations. I think we do have a heightened feeling today, and people do go out and demonstrate, and they will march. And it's something maybe instinctive. The Me Too movement also brought out a lot of this pent up or repressed wish for justice.
Yeah, I was amazed that it was published by Playboy, because I know Playboy isn't what it was when I was growing up, and it was, this men's magazine, and they've always had a publishing, good fiction and literature, that sort of thing, to kind of counteract the pictures of the naked women.
It's like two magazines. Yeah, they were like really two conjoined. It was quite remarkable.
Yeah, but I was still quite astonished, even now, that they would publish. And then I thought, but on the other hand, it is a horror story. And so maybe they really want to scare their presumably male readers who are looking at the bodies of young women and fantasizing about, having sex with them.
Sadomasochism.
Yeah, kind of sadomasochistic thrill, I guess.
Well, I was always so surprised, through the years and decades. I think Playboy magazine may have published more of my writing than any other magazine. Oddly enough.
I assume it was your agent.
Like in the old days, agents always sent everything to Playboy first, because they paid at that time a lot of money. I don't know what it was, like $5,000 or something.
It was more than anybody else did.
So they would start there, then they go down to some other magazines. This is what agents did, which is just, business. But at that time, like Nabokov was publishing, and John Updike and John Cheever, and so there was there were wonderful, serious interviews. Right? A man named Larry Grobel was one of their major interviewers, and he was interviewing everybody. You know, he interviewed Marlon Brando, and maybe Fidel Castro, and Jimmy Carter. That was a famous interview. Like Jimmy Carter was just sort of saying too much. So you're quite right, and where things appear sort of gets forgotten, I think, when they come into a hardcover book, because then they're in some completely new arrangement. And so the origins get forgotten usually.
Oh yeah, you see it in a different perspective, but it is just kind of it just kind of struck me. You know, almost any other story in the book I could see being published in Playboy, but that one just seemed so. Oh, do they know what they're doing? You know, who is there? Who is their audience?
I guess the mainstream magazines like Playboy, I mean, I'm just guessing that they had always been pro-sex in a healthy way, and they didn't want to promulgate in any way just sadistic or a perversion. You know, I don't even know enough about what I'm saying. I just think that there was some sort of distinction between like a magazine that was mainstream, and then you know, they're uplifting and upholding the patriarchal, normal, straight male, whatever, you know, probably something like that. Yeah, but it's not like that anymore, and I don't even know whether it exists. It may not even be published.
I have no idea what it's, if it exists or what it's like. I mean, it may be online now. I don't know.
Anything can be online. You know, the last time I've seen physical magazines is probably a while. You know, like I read the New York Times online. You know, almost. I used to have this huge, like 50 pounds of newsprint.
Yeah.
But I just read it online. So what we lose, and what's maybe not relevant to this particular subject, but we don't have any advertising. Like I don't see the New York Times book review at all anymore. I only read reviews that are isolated. So I'm not seeing any of those big ads. I do get the New York Review of Books, which has nice ads in it. So there was a whole culture that's almost lost now of tasteful, inviting full-page ads for books where you might read some quotes and sort of look around and think, well, I'm going to buy that book. You know, and then you go to a bookstore and buy it. Actually, in those days, Amazon didn't exist, and suddenly I realized I never see those ads anymore, except maybe in the New York Review of Books, where they're mostly university presses.
Yes, I know. It's all, and I feel as if what has replaced it? I sometimes wonder how people hear about books now. You know, I mean, because, I mean, yes, there are sometimes you'll see an ad. I mean, well, in the days when we could travel, there would be ads in the London Underground, you know, for publications.
Yeah. Well, it's online now. Like Eric's wonderful Lonesome Reader, I think, is sort of stepping up to take the place of that.
Yeah, I guess there are. Yeah, there must be different channels and blogs and websites. But I guess I'm sort of still in that old print culture mindset. So I haven't.
Yeah, it's a visual culture. Yeah.
Anyway, I also wanted to say something about the Monster Sister. Now that, to me, that felt like one of my stories. You know, it's the kind of weird within a family and kind of, I don't know, there's this kind of body horror and you know, relationships between women and relationships in families, all of that. I loved it. I love that story. But there's also a line in it that reminded me of a line that I quoted in one of my novels, The Pillow Friend. I used it as an epigraph. And the line is from a story of yours called Thanksgiving. And I just had to look it up. It originally appeared in Omni.
Yes, that's Ellen Datlow.
Yeah, yes. So, but the lines that I quoted were, as dead clammy meat turns to edible meat, as revulsion turns to appetite. How is it possible, you ask? The answer is, it is possible. The answer is, it is. And there was just something in Monster Sister, it's probably completely different, but to me, it made me think of that because it was about how does something happen? Well, it just does. You know, how do we change? How does something become? I think it was more about something becoming normal rather than something revulsion turning to appetite. It was something that's just too strange to accept. But we do. I mean, that's what human beings do. We just it becomes the new normal. And
isn't
that's
it weird? I mean, isn't it really astonishing? You know, like we start off as an idealistic adolescent, let's say, and then you're growing up into a world where increasingly the environment is polluted and the climate's changing, you know, and it just like the unthinkable becomes too thinkable.
Yes.
Like, as you say, it's normalized. It becomes sort of banal, you know, well, this
whether you like it or not,
this creature grew out of the top of my head and then split off, but now she's sitting at the dinner table and I'm not there, and then they all drive away and they're going to some new place, and it's just sort of now it's boring, you know. It's just like the new family. It's just their new normal, and we all came through the Trump years where unspeakable things seem to be going on, like literally every day, every hour. And we were all stunned. You know, in the beginning, people were walking around sort of stunned in 2017 after the inauguration, beginning with the inauguration.
Yes.
And then that got a little more normal, I think. Fortunately, it sort of ended, but we all sort of became zombies or catatonic, I think.
Yeah. I know, it's astonishing. And there is something about, even if it's not, you don't have to like it, but it's just there. There's no point in kind of getting too upset about it, or you just go insane.
Well, it's a phenomenon, I think, that's handled probably most successfully or traditionally in the realistic novel over a period of time. You know, like with a long novel, you can have 20, 40 years where you have one generation passing away and a new generation coming and another generation. So it really mimics that evolution where something unspeakably becomes totally normal just with time, until finally people don't remember what was unspeakable about it.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. Was it really ever any different? Yeah.
Yeah. Women going to college, you know, women doing things, women wearing trousers. Wow. That was considered so Latin not being taught, Latin and Greek not being taught, like in high school. Oh my God, they thought that world was ending, and so forth and so on. All those things seem just unbelievable, but here we are.
Yeah. Well, this is the classic question when anyone writes horror stories or anything sort of fantastical. Have you ever experienced, either seen a ghost or experienced something that could be defined as supernatural?
Well, I shouldn't be saying this in Brian's presence, since the whole idea of his press, you know, is there's this other world and so forth, the uncertainty. Just between us, I am absolutely very skeptical about that. I'm a sort of hard-edged realist. I was married for 10 years to a research scientist. So science is basically materialist, and there are the sort of laws of science. So anything that's supernatural by definition doesn't exist, because there's not anything that's outside nature. Now we can say there are things outside our experience and our expectations and our knowledge. Those things are the unknown. So, I mean, once upon a time, nobody had any idea what was causing the Black Plague. I mean, they thought it came from the devil or people not living good Christian lives or something. Or there were witches who were doing it, but they had no idea that was actually germs. They had no germ theory. I mean, so that seemed really demonic and terrifying because they didn't understand the scientific underlinings that would explain it.
Mhm.
So I would say my own experience, absolutely not. However, we have dreams, and they are parts of our own brain. Our own brains have a lot of regions that collate things, things that are based on reality, but at the same time, they're going into something we can't define, that are, like, to use Brian's term, uncertainties. So within the encasing of the human brain, yes, it's all sorts of things that can't be explained. The average dream is inexplicable, and it's surpassingly mysterious.
Yeah, that's
But
true.
what's very interesting is that all of Gothic literature is literature. None of it's based on real. There never was a haunted house. There are no haunted castles, and there are no ghosts. There are no skeletons running around. All these things are only literary. And so the literature is derived from other literature. It's not like a war novel or a love story based on something that actually happened.
Except, as you say, there are dreams, and there are the fact that we have experiences that even when we know, I mean, I'm sure this has happened to you, because it seems to happen to me more often, and I think it's because I've got cataracts and I'm waiting for surgery. But I will think I've seen something, and it's like, oh, what was, and I try to make sense of it. And sometimes I then am able to make sense of it. I'm looking at it from a different direction. At other times I just go, what went past the window? No idea. But I don't actually think it's a ghost or a spirit or a devil.
Well, who wrote that wonderful story called The Willows? Is that Black?
Oh, yes, Algernon Blackwood.
Blackwood, yeah. Now, the Willows, as I remember it, I haven't read it in a while, doesn't that start off pretty realistically? And then the Willows, the whole descriptions, as I remember, you start getting shivers at some point, and like the whole story is sort of realistic, and that is just a masterpiece, because it's totally immersing. You're just totally immersed in it, And then there's Whistle and I'll Come for You.
Whistle and I'll Come to You. Yes,
Whistle and I'll Come to You.
M.R. James one.
That's M.R. James, and that's where some swirling thing comes along on the beach, wasn't it? Like a swirling sand.
He thinks he's being followed on the beach, and then is that the one where in his room where the sheets, right, seems to, the sheets on his bed or on the next bed.
The sheets, yeah. And I think he sees something on the beach too, so that would probably be like swirling dust. And that's so believable, like you're sort of seeing a swirl. It's like the Willows. There's something in the natural world that's doing something that seems unnatural. Yeah. And you kind of look at it again, like, is there really a face in that tree? Like, like, well, how can the face be in that tree? So then you think, well, I don't really want to look at that too much. Those are the stories. That's the kind of ghost story that seems to be really, really chilling. Yes, really frightening. Yes. Or the Turn of the Screw, which lends itself to such a interesting visual representations, where the governess sort of sees Miss Jessel and Peter Quint, and you kind of see them across this little pond and so forth. And that's another aspect of the ghost story, where it's like a visual hallucination. But is she actually seeing that? Or is that actually real? And it has to be done very carefully. The Haunting of Hill House too. Yes. Is another example. If the movie maker doesn't do it right, it becomes really heavy-handed. Yeah. And that the Haunting of Hill House movie, I thought, was really a failure, because I had actually read the novel recently, and then I saw the movie.
What, the original movie? The original
movie.
Yeah.
And I don't want to see it anymore, because I think they can't. I think nobody could do it. Maybe some movie maker could do it, but they start relying upon the special effects, hammering, and it goes on, and then there's nothing for the actors to do except scream, and their faces are in this almost like a caricature of fear. Whereas when you read it, Shirley Jackson's prose, it just flows right along. You don't have to stare at somebody screaming.
Well, but what I thought was the most effective moment in the film was just, the room is dark. She thinks she's clutching the other woman's hand. They're holding hands tightly. And then when the light is on and she can say, whose hand was I holding? I just think that is the most chilling moment.
Very good. Yeah,
because it's not, you're not seeing anything. You don't, there's no skeletal hand or, ghostly. It's this woman has felt something impossible. And
yes, and the Shirley Jackson novel is a really heartbreaking novel. It's very much like The Member of the Wedding by Carson McCullers. The young woman who's so repressed and sad, and she had a terrible relationship with her mother. She's so yearning for a family, so she takes part in this parapsychology experiment, which is totally ridiculous. There never was a less scientific experiment. It was a completely ridiculous idea that Shirley Jackson came up with. Anyway, she so wants to be in that family. And then near the end of the novel, they expel her. It's like The Member of the Wedding, where the little girl, the young girl, is expelled from the wedding. And the married couple drives away and the little girl's left behind, kind of crying. But in the Haunting of Hill House, the solitary person has been exiled and she's not in their family anymore. And they really tell her to leave, and she gets in the car and she commits suicide. And so the hauntedness of it that people focus on is almost extraneous. It's so much about a person being exiled. And the lottery is like that too, where a person's sort of plucked out of the community and out of her family. Suddenly she's ostracized. And the last line is, and then they were upon her. That Shirley Jackson had this sense of the real tragedy and horror in life is your expulsion from the family and from the community, and then you die. Yeah, I don't think that I write about that, but I recognize that in her writing is very interesting.
A great photograph, Joyce, though. It was
Jane Creech.
Jane Creech. Yeah.
She's a photographer who lives in South Carolina, and she's taken a number of pictures of me. If you have a copy of my memoir, A Widow's Story, that's her photograph of me on the cover. It's kind of blurred. It looks like two images of a face. And she always does interesting things. I think she's totally underappreciated. So we should say something nice about Jane Creech. She's a wonderful photographer. And she's underappreciated, like so many people who are quite brilliant. To me, a book is a physical, visual, aesthetic object. Like it's not just something online or on a screen. A book is a physical object, and you turn the pages, and maybe there's marbled frontispiece, and there's a certain kind of nice paper and covers, and it's a whole. I tell my students that they design their own portfolios for my class. They have to have covers and front covers and back covers and even author photos, because that's actually very hard. It's hard to do, So for my class, my creative writing fiction class workshops, the students design their own books. I mean, they get very excited about it. Some of them are really, really professional looking.
Because that's sometimes the problem, I think, when people are self-published, that they don't pay enough attention to all of that.
That might be. Yeah. Well, each cover to me is very important. Well, Lisa, do you choose your own covers?
Rarely. No, it's usually.
Don't you want to?
I usually just kind of get told what it's going to be, or sometimes I have some input.
Well, if you have an input, very often when people are designing books, I'm sure Brian would agree, they're waiting for some ideas. If you have a really great idea or 5 ideas, the publisher and editor are interested in hearing that. Well, print covers can be beautiful too. The design just of print, it doesn't have to be a visual image, actually. But it should convey some atmosphere or mood, or, you know, something that's special to you.
Well, yes, actually, one question I did have was thinking, do you feel, I mean, I feel that the boundaries between kind of what is, you were talking about the kind of realistic mode and people wanting to read, you know, kind of realism. But do you feel that this isn't quite about that? It's more about genres and what's seen as mainstream and literary fiction. I mean, I just feel it's changed enormously in the past 2 decades, that it's much looser, it's more expansive. People, you know, I don't know, like David Mitchell or someone, you know, can write some, you know, very fantastical, epic kind of, whether it's science fiction or fantasy or horror, and it will be accepted as a work of literature. And of course, then you get Kazuo Ishiguro and Ian McEwan, people who were seen as very realist writers writing science fiction. But
yeah. Well, I guess looking at the history in the 20th century, the 1930s was this focus on this economic catastrophe, you know, the Depression. And there were a lot of fantasies and movies, like, you know, musicals and lots of dancing and so forth. But I think the serious literature was pretty social realism, you know, and looking at the actual roots of the catastrophe and, you know, not fooling around with fantasy, but looking at reality. And then the 1940s and so forth was focused on the war and the enormous impact of World War II, people coming back from the war and trying to adjust and survive. And so I think, again, a focus on reality and history, responsibility of history and bearing witness to the Holocaust and so forth. And, you know, if you're writing about the Holocaust, you basically don't need to write about anything else. It's like, that is the great catastrophe and a horror. You don't need horror fiction.
No, yeah.
Auschwitz, you know, don't need ghost stories at Auschwitz. Then in the 1950s, I think the Cold War became more of a surreal sense. Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb.
Yeah. Mutually assured destruction doesn't even sound real.
People are starting to adjust, to deal with the unspeakable horror of the end of the world. And so probably then there's a little more experimental fiction. I guess Nabokov comes along at that point. And Nabokov is never really a realistic writer. I mean, even Lolita has a lot of superficial realism, like sociological caricatures and so forth. But he's basically a fantastic writer, and everything is sort of prose. It's his language. It's like a phantasmagoria of beautiful prose that he's writing about. And James Joyce, particularly as Ulysses goes on through the day, ever more moving toward the dream world and the surreal. So I think contemporary fiction is just so diverse. It's an era also of memoirs. I mean, it's flooded with memoirs of all sorts of ethnic minorities declaring themselves and in print, you know. And none of that existed decades ago.
Yeah.
Not at all. Women's literature, I mean, women's studies, African-American studies, gay, lesbian literature, all these categories in bookstores that exist now, they didn't exist at all. It was a straight white male writing that was the mainstream, with a few women allowed in, like Flannery O'Connor or Eudora Welty, you know, women of great genius, but they weren't sort of women. I mean, they weren't writing about women's subjects. Flannery O'Connor never, she would be caught dead writing about a woman's subject, you know, like for the Ladies' Home Journal. They're sort of Carson McCullers. They're not really women. And so, but today we have all sorts of women's literature. All sorts of romance. I guess if you're renting a bookstore, I guess romance books are the ones that keep the bookstore open, perhaps. Science fiction, slipstream fiction, speculative fiction.
Anyway, it's been wonderful talking to you.
And I apologize that my kitties went away.
Oh, no, I could see. In fact, that your couch behind you, that looks just like one that my mother had.
Oh.
With the blue, and there's a cat on it right there.
Is there?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, that's Lilith.
Ah,
Yeah, that's right. You're right. Well, it's
yes,
so nice
yes,
talking to
yes.
you, Lisa. It was wonderful. So, Lisa, what are you working on?
What am I working on? I've been mainly writing short stories
Oh,
lately,
good.
but there is a novel that I keep kind of making little notes about that's going to be set in the forest around where I live, which is on the west coast of Scotland. And
It sounds so romantic, west coast of Scotland.
Something I thought to ask you earlier when you were speaking about zombie. Is it correct that next year you have a new book, new novel about a serial killer? That's
A babysitter. It's an expansion, I mean, complete expansion of a story that I wrote some years ago. That was in Ellen Reed magazine. Yeah, it's based upon a serial killer who lived in Detroit. Well, actually, he lived outside Detroit, probably in Bloomfield Hills when my husband Ray Smith and I were living there, 1970s. So the babysitter, you can just type in babysitter serial killer, you'll see about him. He was literally never apprehended, but some people are pretty sure who he was, and he committed suicide. So it's a story that began and ended in like the 1970s.
So yeah, I just want to thank Lisa and Joyce for such an interesting and pleasurable discussion. And thanks for Lilith the cat, who I feel like has been hanging around in the background as a kind of specter of this whole discussion. But thank you everyone for watching as well. And since it came up earlier talking about sort of bookish communities online, I know a lot of people watching this and on YouTube will know we have a wonderful bookish community here where we give lots of great book recommendations, and I certainly receive a lot of great book recommendations here. And I definitely want to recommend reading this new story collection, The Ruins of Contracoeur. I think you'll have some very interesting dreams or maybe even nightmares after reading this. But the Swan River Press is an independent publisher. So if you're now keen to read this book, I'll put a link in the description below where you can directly purchase it from them. And as you've heard, it's a fascinating and chilling collection, and also it's great to support small publishers. So thank you again and goodbye.